Mr. Nekrasov, we understand Russia said that this is a mistaken crossing. However, NATO condemned it, and also U.S. said it's working with the Turkish allies on the possible solutions. What do you think this would mean for the next stage of Russia's involvement on the issue of Syria?
Well, I think first of all, we must accept that the response from the West and some of the allies of the West in the Middle East to the Russian involvement was not, to be honest, a fair, a proper response, because as President Putin himself pointed out, and the military in Moscow as well, that accusations that Russia was bombing moderate opposition and even civilians started to fly even before the planes took off, the Russian planes. So it is obvious that the West is trying to use this whole issue as a propaganda war, having itself, by the way, failed to achieve any significant results in battling ISIS. Now, it has been made pretty clear that the main enemy at the moment is ISIS. And Russia has pointed out that it is going to go after them, and some serious successes have been already achieved. There are also other groups that are violent and terrorist groups that are fighting alongside ISIS, but for some reason they have suddenly become moderate rebels, even though we know perfectly well that these so-called moderate rebels commit crimes, fight along ISIS, fight along with Al-Qaeda, and have been committing terrible, terrible atrocities against the civilians.
I got your point. And let me go to Professor Tanter from the U.S. to respond to what you have just said. Professor Tanter, first of all, the so-called mistake crossing by the Russian side, and secondly, has the United States, together with NATO, for example, been picking bones out of the soup, trying to make a small thing a big fuss so that to prevent Russia from further fight against ISIS in Syria?
Tingwei, number one, the United States and Turkey are putting up a no-go zone in order to protect the Christians and other minorities along the border between Turkey and Syria. And the idea that there's an accidental Russian crossing of a border is just patent nonsense. You can't. Russia has very good air support. There are people on the ground in terms of the radars, and as a result, Turkey and the United States are coming much closer, and the F-22s are being given to Israel in order to make sure that Israel has the wherewithal to counter the Russian SA-4 in Syria. And Russia is not targeting the moderates, is not targeting ISIL. It's having the Iranian proxies from Iraq to come in to do the dirty work against ISIS. Russia is targeting with barrel bombs those Free Syrian Army forces that it says it wants to talk to. This is propaganda. It's nonsense, and Russia is not going to repeat the kind of propaganda warfare that it had in World War II.
I see. Mr. Yanin.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
You certainly have just heard rhetoric coming from both sides. Of course, the European countries are coming in also with certain sides. Having said that, though, what do you make of the debates now going on that Russia has been, at least coming from Russian press, making its precision bombs against, using its precision bombs rather, against ISIS, while they argue that the Americans are bombing the hospitals in Afghanistan, as being claimed by Médecins Sans Frontières?
Well, yes, there's a lot of political rhetoric and a lot of sidetracking also going on there. From a European perspective, the presence now of Russia, which initially seemed to offer the possibility of a return to a Geneva Accord type of a cooperation among the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, now see that there's a lot of conflict going on. There is no coordination, there is mutual accusation, and there is no combined strategy. So there is actually no strategy on both sides, how to lay out a strategy together if it requires boots on the grounds to successfully combat ISIS in Syria.
I see. Let me come back to you, Professor Tanzer, because your president, President Barack Obama, during his public speech at the UN Security Council earlier, said very clearly, here I quote, U.S., quote, is ready to work with any nation, including Russia and Iran, on the issue of Syria. So what kind of attitude has Washington shown so far in order to reflect that statement coming from your president?
The United States has softened its position, and it's in line with the European position with respect to making sure that there's a political transition after the end of which would have Assad to leave. In other words, both President Obama and Secretary Kerry have not taken a position independently of the European nations. So I think that our colleague in Berlin, who said there's a lot of political rhetoric between Russia and the United States on this, that's simply not true. The United States and Europe are together.
But what about working with Russia? From your president, he said, and I quoted earlier, so has the United States done anything specific in that direction? Or willing to do anything specific in that direction? Go ahead, sir.
The United States Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, is working with his counterpart in Russia in order to make sure that Russian and American aircraft do not attack each other accidentally. Israel is making sure that its bombing raids of Hezbollah Iranian-supported Hezbollah in Syria do not accidentally go up against Russian aircraft. So there's a tremendous amount of what is called deconflicting going on, making sure that the two sides, the three sides, do not go head to head with each other accidentally.
Deconflicting, but what about the ultimate strategy, Mr. Nekrasov? Have countries, in fact, conflicting one another in their strategies of dealing with Syria? After all sides have different opinions about whether Assad has to go or not and the timetable for it.
Well, that's the whole problem. You see, it has been, Russia has pointed out from the first day of its bomb strikes that Assad needs to stay because the Syrian army is the only force that is still fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups. Now, immediately, the moment Russia said that, the Western countries and some of the regional countries started saying that Russia wants to keep Assad forever. Now, the point was that before any political or diplomatic dialogue could take place, ISIS needs to be taken out. Before there's no point in trying to launch any initiative in Syria and find a solution, diplomatic solution, until these monsters are destroyed. But it is practically impossible to do that because we hear every day, practically every day, coming from Washington, Paris, London, Berlin, and so on, how bad Assad is. And that has to stop. There has to be a period of time when all of the forces involved will deal with the enemy, with the biggest enemy, not Assad. Assad is not the biggest enemy. ISIS is the biggest enemy.
But let me ask you, Mr.
And once they deal with that, then they can start talking, but not before.
Mr. Nekrasov, may I just follow up a bit, because your government, including your parliament members dealing with the armed forces, have been talking about Russia is likely to send those quote-unquote volunteers coming from East Ukraine going into the battlefields of Syria, even though Russia itself has decided not to send any ground troops. But is that decision, or is that reflection of a decision, necessarily going to more complicate this current situation, Mr. Nekrasov?
Well, first of all, President Putin and the Russian military have already said they're not going to send any Russian ground troops to Syria. That has been pointed out several times. There have been statements made by all sorts of people, including the president of the Chechen Republic and other people, that they are, sort of itching to go and fight on the ground in Syria against ISIS. I don't think we should take these statements too seriously. I don't think anybody, not just the Russians, but the Americans and the others, want to get involved on the ground in Syria, because that will be a completely different level of involvement. I think we are going to see a bombing campaign for several months. I don't know the exact day, probably length, nobody knows for sure, because it depends on the success on the grounds. But already we are seeing that ISIS are retreating. So that there are good signs on the ground.
Really, ISIS are retreating? Mr. Yanning, we heard about the story ISIS destroying another gigantic historic world cultural heritage site inside Syria. We have also heard from your counterparts inside France that they began bombing the ISIS. The Americans say we're also taking actions of various sorts. Is this kind of competition between the US and Russia really likely to help with the situation? Or actually, they both sides just try to claim their own territory? Nothing likely to solve the problem. Mr. Yanning.
Well, it's very complicated indeed. I don't see ISIS fully retreating. There is a lot of tactical retreat and repositioning going on due to the firepower from above. But I think what's important now is that we start building some common ground between the international powers. I think there is agreement on the issue of keeping the integrity of a country like Syria because of the significant spillover effect a disintegrating Syria would have, also in terms of the consolidation of ISIS there. And secondly, there is agreement on taking ISIS out of the equation as one of the starting points to go back to a more political process. And for that, I believe currently all sides know that they need players on the ground to do the job that cannot be done alone by airstrikes from above. And that's the question then, how one assesses the situation. Is there enough boots available on the part of the Kurdish forces, on the part of the Syrian opposition? Probably not. And then you need some of the boots that Assad controls, and maybe also some of the boots that the Iranians are financing. And that, I believe, is the tricky part of a political understanding between Americans, Europeans, and Russians in this.